we're going to talk about actually uh, their suicide attempts and prior to what happened, and then what they're doing in the aftermath. Can everybody put themselves on mute before we start? Okay, so what I would like to do and set up the ground rules. So we're going to have our three amazing guests talk first. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. And then we're going to get to the questions after they answer my questions. So, but please, we want you to interact with them. We want you to ask questions. They are more than willing to talk about their experience and help us understand, you know, their life and what happened before and in the aftermath and how they're healing. And I can't express my thanks enough, because actually, you know, attempt survivors do not talk a lot or don't talk about their attempt. And so this is going to be an amazing learning experience, hopefully for all of you. So I'm just letting people in right now. So we're going to go ahead. I'm going to introduce, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves, but we're going to start with David Lilly. Dave, if you want to just say who you are, just give a little brief bio.
Yeah, I hope everybody can hear me. My name is David Lilly, and I work for CMSU, which is Columbia, Montour, Snyder, and Union County, mental health and drug and alcohol, behavioral health and drug and alcohol. I work as a certified peer specialist and certified peer specialist supervisor. Have been in that field for 17 years and with CMSU for 14 years. And just very recovery focused organization, and get to meet with a lot of people during the course of a day's work.
Dave, thanks. And for those who are just coming on board, can everybody mute themselves? Thank you. And I'm going to go to Samantha Harkins. Sam, do you want to introduce yourself and say a brief bio?
Good morning, everybody. My name is Samantha Harkins. I am the Community Outreach Coordinator for PMHCA, Pennsylvania Mental Health Consumers Association, and I've been with them for about 14 years now.
Thanks, Sam. And last but certainly not least, one of our board members who, and actually everybody today, just like on our last webinar, are good friends of mine, and very brave and courageous people. But Amanda was one of the first people I asked to be on our board. I met Amanda, oh boy, about 2 years ago, and immediately when I met her, we had like a common bond. She goes, whatever you do, I'm gonna help out. So Amanda, you want to talk about yourself and give a brief bio?
Hi, my name's Amanda Hammock. I work for the Pennsylvania Democratic Caucus as a Chief of Staff for Rep. Jennifer O'Mara. As Govan also said, I am on the board of Suicide Prevention Alliance, and he is absolutely right. The phone call, I don't even think I let you even ask what it was. I could tell you were going to ask something, and I was like, nope, I'm on board. So here I am.
Here you are. Thanks, Amanda. So again, for those who are just joining, please put yourself on mute, and then please write your questions as they are speaking, and we're going to answer all your questions. So the first question is, and Amanda, we'll start with you. So how long are you from your first attempt? And just tell us just a little bit about how far out you are, and we'll talk about later about, you know, that experience.
So I am about 25 years from the first attempt and 23 years from the second attempt. I am a 2-time attempt survivor. So quite a while.
Well, we're so glad that you're here. And thanks for sharing. Samantha.
I am a 5-time attempt survivor. I am about 18 years from my first attempt and 6 years from my last attempt.
Thanks, Sam. So glad you're here too. You guys are amazing for sharing. Dave.
Yeah, my first and only attempt to end my life by suicide occurred in January of 1996 when I was 43 years old. And it's just amazing how quickly those 25 years and a few months have gone by so quickly.
Thanks, Dave. So, as each of you attempted, what was going on in your life at the time that gave you thoughts about attempting? Or what was that, triggering moment just before you attempted? Was there one issue or was there several issues converging at the same time? As we know with suicide, suicide is always multi-causal. It's never usually just one issue. It's never usually impulsive. So can you tell us, was it impulsive or was it long thought out? Did you have a plan? So Sam, how about if we start with you?
The very first time that I attempted, I had a very traumatic childhood. I lost my mother by suicide as well. And I went and I lived with my grandparents. And it was the first time I had like real parental figures in my life. And my grandfather got sick and I became his caregiver. And I was 12, 13 years old. And then he passed and I found him. So there was that as a traumatic experience. And then all those years I never knew. My mom passed when I was 7. And I never knew how she passed. They wouldn't tell us. And I happened to find paperwork saying that she died by suicide. So my grandfather's passing, being like my first father figure in my life, really affected me. And in my head, I was like, well, my mom did it. I might as well do it too, because I couldn't deal with the emotions that I was dealing with. So that was my very first attempt.
And how old were you at the time? Don't leave me out.
I was 13.
You were 13 when you attempted.
Yes.
Okay. So was there like a triggering moment for you? Was it when you found that, paperwork that your mom had died by suicide, or what was it, or did you plan this out, or?
It was not necessarily planned out. I always struggled up until a few years ago. I always struggled with coping emotionally. I tended to suppress my feelings and not talk about my feelings. So like everything I went through in my childhood up until, that time in my life, I suppressed everything and it all kind of just started hitting me at once. And that's when I first started, like when I was like 12, 13, I started drinking and doing drugs. And I did some drugs and I had some drinks that night and I just kind of was just like, all right, I'm ready to do this. And I just went with it.
Wow. Okay. So you had a lot of things going on in your life, not just one single issue.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for sharing, Sam. Dave, so what was going on with you at your life at the time? And was it just several issues? Was it one issue? Was it impulsive?
Thanks, Melvin. It was sort of very like a series of compounding events. Like I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder like 17 years prior to that. And there were several reasons that made my symptoms begin to escalate and make me overwhelmed that day. And so I can't identify a single triggering moment, but I was unemployed due to a resignation from my job as a dialysis technician a few days prior, which created for me too much time to think about worst case scenarios. I had been written up for a patient safety issue, which caused some extreme anxiety and worry that my work might have harmed someone. Also, our region had just experienced some serious flooding from a January heat wave that created extreme snow melt and caused telephone and power failures for several days. And so my family needed me then. I recently started a new medication that wasn't effective. My doctor would not change it. He didn't hear me when I said that I'm at the end of my rope. I had been working out of town for the previous 2+ years and living with my sister and brother-in-law, and I felt that I was wearing out my welcome. And I was also felt very detached from my children and my family because I was only home 1 or 2 days a weekend on weekends because I was working out of town. So there were a lot of compounding issues, and it wasn't any one single triggering event for me.
So, and we're going to talk about in the following question about, did you guys seek help before your attempt? And David, sounds like, you were actually going to were you going to a psychologist, psychiatrist, or just getting help from your primary doctor? But you can just say quickly, but you did seek out help.
Yeah, it was my psychiatrist, and he just told me to keep on taking the same medication and everything would be fine, but it wasn't fine.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Amanda, do you want to, share with us, what it felt like before your first attempt or your second attempt? And was there a triggering moment? Was it events converging together?
So I grew up in a household that was really toxic. A lot of physical, a lot of mental, even sexual abuse was going on. And the number one thing in our household was that no one talked about it. There was to be no conversations, it was kind of an unspoken rule. So there was not a lot of communication going on. We weren't allowed to talk to anyone outside of the house. In fact, I can remember in middle school, a counselor must have noticed, for whatever reasons, that I was unhappy and that something, was amiss. And I spoke to him, I think, a total of 2 times before the 3rd time he stopped me in a hallway and said, he kind of pulled me over to the side and said, you can't come talk with me anymore because your parents called and, said that there was no longer allowed to be any kind of conversations. And I remember his face to this day, that it was almost like he knew that stopping that conversation, stopping, being able to speak to me or let me speak with him, that what that would, eventually cause. So a lot of the time for me, it was internalizing, keeping quiet, couldn't, processing things in my own head as a kid. And the abuse kept going. It was like a never ending, cycle of things. And my family had foster kids even prior to me being born and throughout. And, there were 2 of them that were a cause to some of that abuse. And to the no speak kind of, circumstances, I can remember them being there one day and then them not being there the next day. Never knowing why, never knowing if my, parents knew about what was going on or didn't know about what was going on, but it was just, the door was shut, walled up, and we moved on. So from that kind of, going through, I wanted to talk to someone. I wanted to be able to, speak, but, I was shut out. I was terrified of talking, whether it was coming home and hearing it. The situation with the counselor kind of made things worse. I became a individual who resorted to cutting twofold. One, it gave me a representation of, the pain that I felt inside. At least there was a mark to show where that came from, because it just didn't make sense in my head to be able to feel that horrible on the inside and not be, not there be a physical wound. And every time as things kind of built up in, the situations, it was always a new situation, it was something else piling on. And every time I cut, it got to the point each time that I didn't care if the next one meant that I wasn't waking up. So it was a culmination. There was no one, you know, exact moment. There was never a plan per se, but, you know, looking back and seeing, you know, how it began, you know, it was also like, I think I knew every time I would, you know, cut that it was, you know, a chance. And then just, you know, it happened to be one particular day that was just incredibly bad. And that was the first. The second time was
Can I stop you for a second? How old were you when you went?
16.
16.
16. The
Okay.
second time, you know, it was like, well, you know, tried it the first time. Let's see if a second time, you know, works. So
Did the severity of your second attempt increase, or was it the same method? And you don't have to say what method, but
the second time, you know, I'm a very, even at a young age, a very critical kind of thinker. And I thought, well, you know, the first time wasn't successful. How can I ensure the second time is? So, you know, to that end, yeah, to that end, you know, I wanted to be like, hey, you know, I woke up the first time, second time, I don't. Like, it was, you know, which added, interestingly, as I look back, the failed first time, I think added to, you know, the second time's, you know, absolute kind of in my head was, you know, I was going to do it. There wasn't, you know, anything to kind of fall back with.
also you mentioned that you cut. How long did you cut prior to your attempt? You know, research, you know, amongst cutters.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure you were up. Okay, I knew you said you were gonna lay back down, so I thought.
Tracy, can you mute
All right,
yourself?
sounds good. And TJ's yeah, he's waiting for you then when you get there. Okay. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.
Tracy, can you mute yourself, please? So the question was, you know, research usually indicates that someone who cuts usually does not necessarily mean that they are suicidal. And usually as maybe cutting increases, it could become that. When did you first start cutting to your first attempt?
Probably 2 years prior to that, not long after the incident with the counselor. And it initially started because I thought if someone saw it, I'm not the classic, probably, well, what would be termed classic case of, you know, an individual that cuts, although I, you know, not a medical professional, but I was hoping if someone saw a physical thing wrong with me, that someone would intervene. Like, I was desperate for someone to just be able to be like, hey, what's going on? Why is it going on? And then stick with it. You know, as I've gotten older and I realized, like, I get where that counselor was going, you know, but like, had he just stayed and kind of, you know, champions, you know, I guarantee you I would not have gotten to the point. But with the cutting, it started out as really being, you know, as I said, a physical representation for me for pain. And I thought if someone saw, I mean, I was, you know, a lot of cutters hide, you know, it's always in places that aren't necessarily seen. Mine were full on open, you know, and I apologize for being graphic, but like it was all over my forearms and wrists. So like, you know, in my head, I thought, how did no one see? And no one really did. If they did, they didn't say anything. So, you know, it's one of those things that I've now become 20 some odd years later. Like when I look at people and I shake their hands, yes, I look at them, you know, face to face, but I also notice their hands or their arm. It's become a thing because I don't ever want to see that in someone else and not have recognized it for what it was.
Wow. Thanks, Amanda. Sam, same question. So you said you attempted 5 times. So did the severity of your attempt increase each time, or, you know, how did that work for you?
I'm not sure how to answer that exactly because the very first time that I attempted, I overdosed as well as I stabbed my arm open right on my vein. So sorry, I don't mean to be too graphic for anybody. But from there on, pills were usually my go-to. There were some other more drastic attempts, but pills were usually my go-to.
Thanks, Sam. So hold on, Sam, 'cause I'm going to follow up with you with the next question. So, prior to your attempt, did you reach out to family or friends, or, at 13, I don't know if you were seeing a mental health professional. Were you trying to get help, or did you reach out for help at that age, prior to your attempt?
As I said earlier, I never handled my emotions very well. I was very suppressed and I kept everything in. My family forced me into therapy right after my mom passed, and I was in therapy for years, but I was just closed off. I wouldn't talk to anyone, even a therapist. I just sat there in my sessions and I wouldn't say anything.
So
I
even
didn't
though,
want to be helped.
okay, so even though that you had thoughts of suicide, you weren't sharing that with anybody at that point.
No.
Dave, how about you? So, did you reach out to anybody, friends, family, and try to express that you were really struggling? What was it like for you? What was going on?
Well, other than the doctor that day, it was really difficult for me to reach out to anyone. There was a lot of tension in the home. My wife and I weren't talking because I had lost my job. My children at the time were only, let's see, 11 and 6. So I couldn't speak with them. And I didn't want to burden my sister anymore. She was always my go-to, because I was beginning to feel that I was wearing out my welcome there more than I'd already thought. So, it just, I didn't really reach out to anybody because when you're in that emotional distress, you don't really think about who you can reach out to. That emotional thing is so overwhelming that you don't plan the next step. But I do know, and I firmly believe this, that if I would have had a peer specialist to talk to that day, the result and the outcome probably would have been much different.
So, and I'm going to ask this of everybody, but along with that question, Dave, were you showing, in hindsight, were you showing any signs? Like we know all the warning signs. That were you sleeping too much? Did your personality change? Were you giving away anything? Were you showing anybody any indications that you were suicidal, in an indirect way?
No, Govin. It was very impulsive. It came on in one day. I was alone and I was contemplating whether I wanted to do this by firearm, but I was afraid that my daughter would be the one that would come home and find me and the effect it would have on her. So I overdosed, took my firearm with me, which was confiscated by the police at the time. And so, no, there wasn't any long range plan or any long range implications or signs or warning signs that I was going to do that.
Thanks, Dave. Amanda, so did you reach out to any family or friends, or again show any signs in the days, weeks, months leading to your attempt?
Going back to, by that time, 16 years, ingrained in my head, that talking to people was absolutely out of the questions, including friends. You probably would have never, I might have been pegged as being maybe slightly unhappy, but no one would have ever seen, it coming. No one would have, I was good at hiding the abuse. I was perfectly capable of hiding my intentions. Even with, visibly having any marks that might have said anything, it got to the point where even that was, probably the only thing that might have been noted, but you know, I didn't think I could, let alone, even if I did, I felt I was going to be shut down. So what was the point in, you know, reaching out? There at that time there was no point. And I think a lot of that is that proverbial rock bottom that, you know, I at least talk about, you know, having reached to, you know, that point was, you know, there was no one left. I wanted there to be someone left, but there was no one to talk to.
Now, when I asked about any indications, you were cutting. Do you think if someone would have actually noticed, and maybe as we know that asking the question is hugely important with suicide prevention, do you think if someone would have asked you and noticed that you were cutting, do you think that would have changed if someone would have shown that they cared?
I would like to think so. You know, the problem often is, and I recognize this in twofolds, the work that we do now and, you know, having been in that situation, it is a really hard question for someone to ask another individual, but it's so poignant, and those that can ask it have the empathy to be able to kind of share. And I think that that's what I really would like to think, that had someone shown that empathy, had shown the true care, that at that point, you know, had the question been asked, would I have been open enough to say something? I think so. I was actively looking for someone to say something that, you know, meant that there was kind of a lifeline, so to speak, that, you know, I didn't have to just kind of sit there and suffer in silence and feel completely, it's a weird mixture of hopeful and hopeless. You know, I kept hoping someone would say something, but the more there was silence and the more that there wasn't anything kind of feeling like being thrown out, I was becoming hopeless to the situation. So, you know, again, I would like to think that I would have, but I also think that that depends upon the person. One of the things that I still stand by to this day is I think that it takes a certain type of individual, that not only to ask, but to get someone to be able to respond to them. And, you know, one of my big, and Govan absolutely knows this, fake or in an individual not being genuine when they ask someone, people in my position, or people, I don't want to talk for everyone, but you can sense that, you know, a fake how are you, or a fake, you know, kind of just surface level isn't going to get someone to, you know, to be able to open up like that. So I think, depending if that person would have been an empathetic person and truly meant it, and I felt that, I think I would have, you know, said something. And you know what, would that have been the end in terms of not having gone forward? Oh, I absolutely believe so.
Thanks, Amanda. Sam, same question. So obviously you had a lot of things going on with you leading up to your first attempt. Do you think if someone would have asked you, are you thinking about suicide, or, you know, just took, you know, sat down with you and showed that they cared about you and asked about what's going on with you, how do you think that you would have responded to that?
Honestly, if I think hard enough, I'm pretty sure somebody did, but like I said, I was very suppressed. I was very shut down. I was very emotionless, even though I was feeling so many emotions. Outwardly, I was showing no emotions. So, I just denied it. Almost every attempt, I denied it. I denied that I was having any ideations or anything was wrong. Even though I know you could see it, it was visible, but I still was just like, I'm okay.
And no one like pushed the issue, was persistent to try and go, Sam, I know you're not okay. Did anybody try and do that, or you shut
on the
people
one
down?
attempt, yes. And they actually, it was the night before one of my attempts, they actually called the ambulance on me, and they came and they took me to the hospital. And the hospital asked me all the, you know, ideal questions and, you know, are you thinking about it? And I said, no. I said, I don't know where they're getting this from. And they released me. And then the next day I had another attempt.
Wow. So if this person would have, let's say, gotten a lot more information, whether or not you would have gave it, do you think that if you were involuntary committed at the time, do you think that might have helped you? Or, or that would have just delayed what you were planning on doing? In
I
hindsight,
can't
know it's hard
exactly, yeah, I can't exactly answer that, only because I was hospitalized once, and that was after my first attempt, and that that was more traumatizing than my attempt was, with the circumstances and things that happened while I was hospitalized. So I can't say for sure if it would have helped me or stopped me. I struggle with suicidal ideations, so I can't guarantee that that would have helped me or not helped me. I don't know.
Yeah, we're going to ask a further question about how people treat you when you're in the aftermath of your attempt, as in a hospital that you were at, and whether that helped or not. But Dave, if you were asked like how you were, or they saw like all these events that you were, talking about, do you think that if someone would have just reached out prior to your attempt, do you think that might have helped you either not attempt at all or delay it? What are your thoughts in looking back?
Yeah, I think I just addressed that here a little bit ago, that if I would have had a peer specialist, or if peer support services would have been available at that time, I believe I would not have attempted. If my wife would have been a little bit more understanding about me losing my job, saying and being a little more supportive, saying, hey, it's okay, you'll find another job, rather than shutting down and making a lot of tension in the home, I think things would have been a little bit different, and I would not have attempted.
Thanks. Okay, next question. So, and Sam, I'll follow up with you. So, when you went to the hospital after your attempt, and I don't know how many times that you did go to the hospital in your attempts, what was your experience like? Was it absolutely negative, or were any of the hospital staff helpful? Did that lead you to maybe even hide your feelings even more because of your experience there?
I was only hospitalized the very first attempt, and it was a terrible experience, but that terrible experience, I think, is what led me to this field, because where I was sent to, I watched the mistreatment of other patients and the mishandling of other patients, and I got myself in a lot of trouble in patient standing up for other patients, even though I was in a dark place and I needed help. I just don't, I think, no, I don't know where to go with that one. There's a lot I could say on that topic, but it did not help me.
Yeah, we hear in this field, obviously you're in this field too, a lot of the horror stories of people going to hospitals or treatment centers, and they swear that after their experience there, that they're not going to go back, and that their attempts are going to increase to the point to where that unfortunately then they die by suicide. So Amanda, were you hospitalized, or how was that experience for you?
So I was not, closed door theory. So, again, didn't happen, didn't see it, didn't, kind of put it behind a locked door. I will say, had I had an option, or had I perhaps been in, a hospital, even to this day, I have an aversion to anything clinical that involves talking about my attempts, or the same kind of stark, sterile, white walls, kind of lack of empathy. And I'm not saying every place is this way, but it has been in my experience, you know, having seen facilities or, you know, gone into them, at least in terms of, you know, visiting them or whatnot, that same starkness in my head was the same silence I was already a part of. So I would have ran, you know, probably screaming out of one of them. And again, to this day, I just feel there's so much that needs to be changed in terms of, you know, especially I think I'm, you know, emergency rooms. I don't know if necessarily, you know, there's always, if they're equipped to kind of handle things in the moment the way that I at least would feel would be better. But no, it's actually a thing. It's actually a thing to where I'm like, yeah, nope. It's 4 white walls. It doesn't even have to be white wall, you know, facilities. And in my head, I see 4 white, solid, empty, no empathy, no, you know, lack of emotion kind of, you know, places. And why would I have wanted to when that was already in my head? That was already the life that I was in, and clearly wanted not to be a part of, because I was attempting to get out of it, that I would have probably been, it would have absolutely been worse, I think. So I don't know if that's luck in terms of not having, you know, been in it or not. But that's my experience with it.
Thanks, man. Dave, were you hospitalized in your attempt?
Yeah, which one do you want to talk about, Govin? My memory is vague between the time the state police found me and my trip to the ER. I do remember being awakened by the ambulance siren, blood draws to monitor my lithium level every hour while I was in intensive care was not fun. Drinking charcoal was not fun. And like I said, my memory is kind of vague there, but I do remember the ICU nurse flopping the medical chart on my chest as they were loading me into a helicopter to be flown to Hershey for emergency dialysis. I remember once in Hershey that while I was on the dialysis, my legs wouldn't stay still and I kept asking for ice chips. When I regained consciousness, the hospital psychiatrist told me, you're going to have to leave the hospital because we don't accept your insurance. I can't treat you as an outpatient psychiatrist. So then the ambulance ride to the next hospital was very lengthy. I did not appreciate having to be strip searched when I arrived at the second hospital. I did not appreciate walking outside from the intake unit to the inpatient unit in paper slippers from the first hospital. My stay at the second hospital was not very helpful. I explained that I needed hospital care until I could look myself in the mirror and say, I'll never attempt suicide again. However, on the third day, they came in and said, you'll have to leave today because your insurance will not authorize any more days. So discharged on a Friday, I was given a new medication, a follow-up appointment with a new doctor. And again, he wouldn't take my insurance. So my mania worsened a few days later, and I was admitted to the local mental health unit where fortunately there was a visiting doctor, a psychopharmacologist from Greece who went with a more traditional medication, and the length of stay was very helpful. So yeah, there were multiple hospitalizations immediately following my attempt, and the only one that panned out was the third one.
Wow. So how were you feeling in that, going through that experience and getting basically kicked out from one hospital to the next, and you know, obviously, you know, you were feeling at your lowest point to have an attempt, but now after you did attempt, people reinforcing the fact that they kind of didn't care because it was all about insurance.
That's true, but during that interim, the people that I needed to care did care. My wife came around and she was there while I was on dialysis. She went to Hershey. My sister, I had not worn out my welcome. She was there. She initiated a lot of prayer change and was there. I could hear her voice as they were doing dialysis on me until they put me under.
Wow. Thank you all for sharing. Horrendous. And Sam, you said you had some horrendous experience. Anything that you want to kind of like, what was like that worst experience that you had in one of your hospital stays?
I would say it was just the treatment of other patients. Like they didn't care about their illnesses or their trauma. They just cared about doing their job.
Well, let's go
And
back to you. What was, because you, as all of you, here are cares for others. You help others, you go out of your way, to save lives and make a difference. But particularly you, how was it? How did they treat you?
well, I was, like I said, I was a little outspoken about their treatment of other patients, so I wasn't treated very well. And they kept threatening to keep me longer if I couldn't, mind my place. But my stay there with the treatment of me and other patients ensured me that I never wanted to go back to a hospital ever again, regardless of how I felt. So I made sure to get my way out of it. Every attempt that I ended up at the hospital, I made sure to talk my way out of it so that I never ended up hospitalized again.
Okay, thank you. So, Amanda, so what help did you get after your attempts? Did you get any help? Did the environment that you were living in at the time, did they, double down and care for you? Or was your attempt in a sense, did your family know that you actually attempted? And what help did you seek or get, or what was going on after your attempt?
So I am probably a serial, individual that goes through more therapists, more, support groups, more kind of like, and I liken it to trying to find the right church or trying to find, the right whatever, and believe it or not, I never did find the right, at least medical professional. I have found support groups, but never anything. And it's kind of, wait for it. I never felt right until 2 years ago, bumping into you and finding kind of this role in which I could talk about it. I could, feel comfortable enough as an adult. It was a long progression of figuring out that I could talk to people, that there was no one there to now as an adult stop me from, speaking about it, or, being disregarded for it. There's so many things that I learned kind of, in my own terms. Being silenced and not being able to speak to someone is probably terrible and horrific and from all aspects, but it also gave me an absolute sense of self-reliance that as I got older, making hard decisions like cutting toxic individuals out of my life in order to kind of gain my own healing, I could do. So from that, it was kind of born this, all right, I don't have to accept it and I can move on. So, there was never one particular thing that worked. It's always kind of been a combination of things. I will say I have 2 children, having my children, having my husband, that is when things like I went, I'm not going to be their reason for desperation and I didn't want to, the third time was never going to happen. Once I found somewhere, which was my family, my children, my husband, I wasn't going to be their reason for, you know, what could it be if I wasn't here. So it wasn't necessarily therapists, it wasn't, you know, one, it was just a combination of things, and it still is, you know, with having met you 2 years ago on an off chance. It was actually the first time I ever spoke. I was never not willing to speak about it. I was never asked, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? Like no one would know. How would you know who I am now versus, you know, who I was then? It's not the same person. You know, so I don't walk, the signs don't walk with me, you know. But again, it was a combination of things then. It's still a combination of now, of finding different things. And as we all know, it's never one size fits all. You know, just like there's, you know, no one size fits all onto the who, what, when, where, hows of any of this. So still finding things. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Was there an important connection, you know, right after your first attempt or your second attempt that you could lean on at the time, or did you kind of still feel alone?
Me.
Huh?
It was me. You know, I as sad as that might sound, and it was in the moment, right? You know, in the moment, it was absolutely tragic. In the moment, I was like, wow, you know, I attempted and I'm still, you know, here, and it's like nothing ever happened. You know, there was no sense of care. There was no sense of, you know, outreach. I think the second time that I realized, you know, no, I hate saying it, but no one was coming to save me, even from myself. So I needed to get my proverbial stuff together and figure out how do I, you know, move on. And, you know, again, it built from there. It was probably not even 2 years after that I met, you know, my husband, who, you know, was one of the first people that I could have that conversation with. And it wasn't a shock. It wasn't a, you know, like his level of empathy for the situation was why I could have the conversation and finally, you know, be able to discuss. And to his credit, was very patient, was not someone, you know, who, and now that I'm sitting here talking about it, I look back at it and I go like, you know, I'm pretty sure he was checking, like, because he understood everything. So he was the person that was probably checking my arms while I slept because he knew of the situation, and that just built, you know. And then after him, there were other people, you know, to be able to speak with and so forth. And that's when I realized it was okay. And, you know, healing, I guess, for that matter, started and continues.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, Amanda. So Sam, what about you? So what help did you get after your attempt, and was there an important connection? You know, not just, obviously you had 5 attempts. So what stood strong after your last attempt till now? But who did you rely on? Who did you connect with, if anybody?
Like Amanda, I relied on myself. After my last attempt, it happened to be the same time frame as I got my son, and that situation happened. And then I abruptly became a parent, and that's just kind of what kept me going, because he saved me without realizing that he saved me. Not that he's gave me a reason or a purpose, but it was just, you know, as a child that didn't get the love and attention and direction and help that they needed and the protection, I wanted to provide that for him. So it changed my whole perspective on life.
So in a sense, was your important connection your son in that context?
Very much so.
Did you ever go to a psychologist, psychiatrist to seek out help, or did you just turn inward and rely on yourself still?
After my first attempt, I was put into outpatient for about a year, And that didn't really do much for me because I was still the closed off teenager that didn't want to open up and talk. And then after my grandma's passing, when I was about 21, I went to a therapist because I really struggled. I had PTSD and I struggled a lot with her death. And the therapist, like Amanda said, it kind of made it more traumatic for me. It affected me in a negative manner versus helping me like the intention was. And I had another attempt not long after stopping therapy. And then after that, I didn't seek any type of help.
Thanks, Sam, for sharing. Dave, so basically you said after your attempt that your sister and your wife were there for you. Did you have any other important connections that, you know, you leaned on or turned to professionally or, you know, with friends and family?
Yeah, for me, Govin, a new outpatient doctor that would listen to what was going on with me and better management of my medications, a different type of medication, a therapist, and like Amanda was saying earlier, you know, I do some support groups such as NAMI and Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance. And I also had an owner of a janitorial service that gave me a job 1 month right after my attempt. So those things were very helpful. That for me, the medical model, the doctor managing the medication and therapy really helped.
Thanks. So with that being said, Dave, I'm just going to keep up with you right now. So what are you doing for yourself today? What, you know, since the years since your attempt, what do you know that works for you today? How do you, you know, get through day by day and how has that attempt affected you?
I've recovered from the attempt, and I know that that's never ever going to happen again. But today, my faith, my church family are really very probably first and foremost important. My employer, CMSU, my co-workers and staff here can recognize if I'm acting somewhat out of the ordinary and can spot it. And oftentimes they'll say, hey, David, slow down and breathe. You're going too fast today. Again, the medication, I continue to take medication on a daily basis. And even though my sister passed away several years ago, my children are now much older, 25 years older than they were during my attempt. And I stay in contact with them by text or phone almost daily and spend as much time as I can with my 4 grandchildren. And again, same issue, my occupation as a certified peer specialist, and all the focus on recovery helps me stay aware and practice my own recovery. So those are some of the things. I could go on and on about that, but I know we're getting a little pressed for time. So
Thanks, Dave. Sam, to you, what, and you know, you earlier said that, you know, your son is keeping you kind of grounded, but are you doing anything else? Are you going to a mental health professional? Are you talking to anybody that's helping you stay sane in this crazy world? But also in the aftermath, since it's, I think you said the last attempt was 6 years. So, you know, what's working for you since besides your son?
Honestly, besides my son, I mean, that's a big factor for me because it helps. I help me. I don't seek professional help right now, but I've learned how to cope, and I've learned that my suicidal ideations are just feelings that I can work through. And my son helps me with that because he needs me, but also, again, I think I stated at the beginning, I'm also a suicide survivor. I lost my mom to suicide, so I would never want him to feel the way I felt as a child losing my mother. So it helps me to learn to cope in those moments where I feel like I'm really struggling, and it gives me the motivation and the courage to push through.
And just so you know, Sam, we need you too. So you are not alone. Amanda, so same question. So what ongoing help, if you are getting help today? I know you said your husband and your kids are there for you, but what's making things work for you today?
It's a combination, as you said, you know, my children, you know, my husband, this nonprofit, believe it or not, you know, a lot of the work that we do, you know, it's self-healing in a way, you know, as I call it, my day job, with Rep O'Mara, who lost her own father, you know, to suicide. That's a unique connection that, you know, I think that we have. And, you know, being able to know that in a way it's a conversation, should I ever need to, you know, have that, you know, conversation or, you know, talk about things, or she does, you know, it's kind of a two-way street. I love the fact that when a lot of the conversations come up about things that, you know, we're doing, in terms of, you know, with our work, you know, being asked if something as simple as, does a graphic, you know, look, you know, good, that we might be using, say, for Suicide Prevention Month or whatnot, and being able to kind of give that insight, I think, you know, that's probably been the biggest help for me, is providing insight as to what the world of suicide prevention that wants to help looks like to individuals who have attempted, just like how it should look like to individuals who are lost survivors and so forth and so on. Being able to provide that is, I think, huge. It kind of, you know, drives me. Being able to be a part of a board where I know that we all kind of come from all sorts of different facets of this, but knowing that maybe the individual that needs to reach out, you know, is thinking of things, and that maybe because I, you know, have been out there and saying, hey, you know, I've been there, you know, have a conversation with me, drives me, you know, so much of this work really has, and I've seen it, you know, from day one of being open about it, which was the complete reverse of my kind of life story, you know, going from staying quiet to now being a mouthpiece and just, you know, as open. As Samantha said, I am loud and proud of being the person in the room that is willing to say, hey, I've told the story probably, I think our initial opening for suicide prevention, our webinar, of when we were sitting in a meeting with all sorts of different groups from all over the state of Pennsylvania, and they were discussing suicide prevention and, you know, going on. And I sat there, and this was the first time, and this was your fault, by the way, Govan, sat there the whole time, and it was just eating me, not necessarily because I felt people weren't wanting to help, but it was the same thing that I had heard over and over and over and over again. And it seemed very clinical, very sterile. And finally, I got a hold of that mic and I went, ugh. And I'm pretty sure I saw you in fear. And I, you know, my question was, how many boards in that room or organizations had suicide attempt survivors on them? And I don't even remember if one hand went up. And I went, there's your problem. There's your problem. If you don't have individuals, we are literally the closest thing that you can get to understanding. And that's huge, because there's three of us and there's three completely separate, you know, situations and stories and whatnot. But if you don't have this kind of voice sitting at that table and saying, you know, no, stop putting the happy face and the balloons on your suicide prevention awareness graphic in September, because that's not necessarily what, you know, if I would have seen that, you know, in my state, I'd have been like, oh, that's cute. And that wouldn't have reached me. That wouldn't have. So being able to be that person that sits in these rooms or sits at these tables or is on a Zoom as, you know, a loud mouthpiece, and be able to be a, you know, an individual that can relate and, you know, speak, has helped me immensely. Terrifying to have these kinds of conversations, because they're messy, they're raw, they're personal, they're vulnerable. But you know, this has been probably the most healing thing I have done in the 25 years since the first attempt. So,
Well, I know that you are all forces of nature. So as we get close down the, please write your comments or your question. I know we have one question waiting, but as we're getting close, so is there anything for all of you that has turned this negative experience that you had with your attempt into a positive? What has done that for you, Amanda? Since you're there, I know basically. Thank you for you know being vulnerable and to opening up and sharing your story along with everybody else's. But what was it for you that has turned, you know, obviously that negative experience where you wouldn't talk about with anybody into now you're speaking out?
so I think that because I was given the chance, and you know, you have to take some credit for that. Given the chance to be able to talk, given a chance to have a platform like this, one of the things that I will absolutely say is that I have a vastly different outlook on life. And it increasingly becomes that way as I, you know, get older and further out from, you know, my last attempt, is that, you know, and it does sound cheesy, but every moment matters. Every, like, it's like taking off or putting on, I don't know which way, glasses that you see things, you know, from a different perspective, and being able to see them that, you know, conversations do matter. You know, I am a perfect example of that. And I didn't even realize that that was something until I was preparing for this. And, you know, we've used that as, you know, our organization from day one. And I didn't realize how that was even my, you know, part of the story. Had that conversation, you know, been earlier, maybe there would have been a difference. But to be able to have these conversations now, you know, it is really what it makes every day that much more meaningful.
Thanks, Amanda. Samantha, what are your thoughts on that? So in the aftermath, how have you turned, you know, not only one, not only two, but 5 experiences into now 6 years out? What has been a positive motivator for you in your life? And not only your son, but besides your son.
Like Amanda said, it definitely makes you look at life completely differently, and especially after 5 attempts, you realize, like, okay, you're not meant to, you know, not be here. There's a reason for it, and I think a lot of my reason is to help others. Is, you know, man, you're the only one on here that really knows me. Well, Tracy does as well. Is I'm a very raw person myself. I'm very much what you see is what you get. And I think I am that way because of my trauma and my experiences of my attempts. And it just makes you be comfortable with who you are. And because of that, allows you to attract the people that need the help the most, I think, because I get a lot of people that reach out to me that I don't even know. They could be friends of friends or anything, that because of my experiences, and they're in a dark place, they feel they can connect with somebody who's open about their experiences. So as traumatic as my experiences were, I'm thankful for my experiences because it's allowed me to become who I am and be able to do what I do.
And you're good at it. So thanks, Sam. Dave, what about you? What's positive? And the nice part about each of you is that each of you are working in the field of helping others. So what's working for you, Dave?
Similar to what Amanda said, just having that lived experience and the platform to be able to use that lived experience to help other people. I continue, as my schedule allows, to advocate for suicide prevention. And this is my first webinar for the Suicide Prevention Alliance.org, but I know that Govan, you and I and Heidi have worked on some things in previous years. And I was also privileged to share my story in a video project to promote the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The Stories of Hope and Recovery video project was created in 2010, and it features stories of Terry Wise, Jordan Burnham, and myself. And when you figure the number of DVDs that SAMHSA put out, along with the therapist guide, when you figure the number of views on the Lifeline, when you figure the number of views on YouTube, and when you figure in the number of presentations that Terry, Jordan, and myself have presented, I would just venture to say that we've reached more than 10,000 people. So having that platform and using that lived experience to help others. My sister always said, something good will come out of this mental illness, David. You just have to wait for it. And she was right.
Thank you. So last question before we have a couple questions, but the last question is, what would you tell somebody who, may be watching this and on YouTube and is thinking about attempting suicide, is having suicidal thoughts? What would you share with them, and hopefully what they can learn from you in your experience in life? What would you want them to know, besides obviously don't attempt, but what would you want to share with them? Start with Sam.
And I knew you were gonna do that, Govan. I think honestly, that's kind of a hard question to answer in the way that you put it, if it was just somebody watching YouTube, because every situation is circumstantial. But if I had to give one piece of advice, and I actually have it tattooed across my chest, is that it does get better. Because when you're in that moment and it's a dark place and you feel hopeless and like there's nowhere to go, it doesn't feel that way. And clearly I'm a 5-time attempt survivor. I've been in those dark places. I understand that feeling, but if you fight through it and you get to where you want to be, it gets better.
Thanks, Sam. Dave?
Again, for someone watching on YouTube, I'm pretty sure you're going to have the click on thingy with suicide prevention Lifeline somewhere on the YouTube thing as well. I'm going to tell them, that you can get through this if you can talk to someone. And I had a whole list of things here as far as what I would say to someone. And I saw a blurb come through from one of our therapists saying, what would you tell a therapist to do? I would say, be non-clinical. Don't jump to that clinical. Are you suicidal? Do you have a plan? Do you have the means? No. Dig deeper and find out what happened that makes you feel like you want to die.
Thanks, Dave. Amanda, what would you want to share with somebody?
Wow. A lot, but how do you sum that up? You know what? You have to talk. You have to start a conversation. You can't wait for the conversation to happen, because if you wait, it might not. You need to initiate. Conversations are messy. They're hard. None of this is going to be easy. As Sam said, I'm, as she said, a very raw, in your face. I'm the same way. You can't wait for someone to come in and start the conversation per se, because someone might not necessarily, in my case, no one ever did. So just start it somehow. Start small. Start with something, even if you can't feel that that's the thing that you can start with something else, and with the right person, and always try. If the first person isn't it, try someone else. But I would say that conversation absolutely is imperative to have, because I'm an example, Sam's an example, David's an example. As cheesy as the Hallmark greeting card as it sounds to so many sometimes, that it does get better, it really does get better. But that path is not necessarily going to be cupcakes and rainbows and all the other things. It's going to be difficult, but there will be people you will find. It doesn't feel like it right now, but you will find those people. I found those people, you know, others have found those people. You just have to hold on.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Governor, I just want to add something on top of what Sam and Amanda said. Those conversations can be very difficult, and don't hem haw around. If someone's showing warning signs, you need to throw that question out there right away. Are you suicidal? Are you feeling about wanting to die? You can't sugarcoat it. You need to address it right away if they're showing warning signs.
Thanks, Dave. One of our amazing supporters, Kathy Wallace, who's knee deep in suicide prevention, she asked a really great question. So after your attempt, would going to a support group specifically for attempt survivors, would that have helped you? Dave?
Yes, definitely. I know NAMI and DBSA really helped me with a lot of the stuff that was going on with me at the time. They weren't a suicide survivor or attempt survivor support group per se, but yes, I do really believe in those. And also, if you've lost a loved one or someone to suicide, the grief support groups as well too can be very helpful.
Thanks, Dave. Amanda, what are your thoughts?
I think had I had that, you know, at least for the first time, I don't think second time might have, you know, been an option, at least in my head. I fully support groups. I think that, you know, especially peer-to-peer, I think are invaluable. I think that, you know, being able to talk in a room full of individuals that are from, you know, kind of the same situation is just everything. I also believe that, you know, finding them is hard because I don't think there's enough. And I think that, you know, again, that goes back to even, you know, this situation, finding attempt survivors to even talk about it. So I think that there's clearly a gap in support groups, which, you know, is a whole nother thing to address. But I think, you know, in my particular situation, that it would have been useful. I absolutely don't think that there would have been a second attempt had it been useful. And, you know, I full support of support groups.
Thanks. Samantha? Would it work for you? What do you think about attempts survivor support groups?
I think in my younger years, my first few attempts, I don't think it would have done much for me. But as I got older and I understood more of what was going on with me and, you know, my emotions and all of that, I do believe that it would help because, like Dave and Amanda both said, peer-to-peer is so important. And nobody's going to understand you better than a peer. So to have had that available before one of my attempts, it would have most definitely been beneficial for me.
Well, obviously, and Amanda knows this, and Kathy knows this, and anybody in this group who knows us, is that's one of our big missions, is to really focus on increasing attempt survivor support groups across Pennsylvania and across the country, because we know that there's very few of them, especially peer-to-peer. So we have to do that. And we have these three amazing people to vocalize what we need. So thank you for sharing. But we have another question from Elise, and she said, what advice would you give your therapist or provider how to rationally detach from this? She says, I truly do care and want to provide support to the people I see every day. But if the walls are up, like you mentioned, Samantha, and they attempt after leaving my office, it's very difficult for me. So Sam, what would you say to that?
Like Dave said, try to detach as much as you can from the clinical side of things and just be a person, be a human being. I think if I were in that position again, like where I was in a dark place and I was trying to talk to my therapist, I don't want to hear all your clinical reasonings or ideas or, you know, responses to things. I want to know that you're actually hearing me, understanding me, and feeling what I'm feeling. So I think to be as empathetic as you can be without crossing your, you know, the boundaries of things, I think is really beneficial for somebody in my position, if that made sense.
Thanks, Sam. Amanda.
So I kind of, when I first read that, I thought of a particular situation in which I was at a fundraiser, and it was complete random seating. And there were loss survivors, and there were attempt survivors, and there were people that, were working in the field and, kind of all mingling. And I sat down at a table, and at the table were two sets of parents who were loss survivors. And the reason I liken this to that question is because that same kind of feeling in terms of, well, if that person walks out the door and they kind of, cut it off, reminds me of that same kind of feeling that loss survivors have, which Govan and I have talked about, prior. Conversations between loss survivors and attempt survivors absolutely, I think, should happen, in of itself, to be able to kind of understand these two similar but separate worlds. And I mean, what the conversation that occurred for me and those two sets of parents who were unaware of my situation as much as I was unaware of theirs, I remember distinctly saying to them that, and I get it, to at least in the broad sense, the guilt that comes with it, is that from my own experience, at least in that moment, there would have been, it becomes a finite moment where there's nothing in that exact moment. There is nothing that someone, at least for me, could have said, done, sky wrote across the sky, don't. That was it. The decision was made. It had no bearing on anyone else's input but my own. And so that guilt process of worrying about, well, what happens if, I think you have to be very careful. You can't walk away with that guilt of, so long as you're doing what you, and obviously you are, because you made the statement that you are, you're very empathetic and very caring. So long as you are doing that part, the story's chapter is up to the individual. And you just have to be careful in terms of not taking on the guilt for something, as so long as you are trying your best. And obviously you sound like someone that is trying their best. I can only gauge that through text, but that's what I would have to say with it.
Thanks, Amanda. David, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I know who that came from. I think it came from one of our therapists. And again, I'm going to say that the clinical approach is important, but another important thing is, like Amanda and Sam both said, to care about what the person is feeling. I think that is huge, what they're feeling. But also clinically, you need to match the clinical intervention to the age cohort of the person. Or there's a youth and young adult, are they an adult, or are they an older adult? So I think clinically that's really important, is to match up your intervention with who's sitting across from you.
Thanks, Dave. And Elise, that was a great question. And you are showing a lot of empathy just by being here. And you're showing that you care. So that's a huge step in itself. So I want to thank you for being here and asking that question. A couple other comments. Kathy said, let's do this again. That's excellent. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else have any questions before we end this today? I can say that I honestly, I've been involved in this work for almost 20 years now. And I learned a lot from you guys today. That you shared, obviously a lot more than some of our conversations. And I want to, really, really, really thank you for being the brave, courageous people you are, because it's things like this that save people. It's things like this that impact helpers like Elise and others that are involved in suicide prevention that we need, especially attempt survivors of the underserved voice that we need to get out there. And people are afraid to vocalize and use their voice because of the stigma involved in suicide. So I can't thank you enough. Does anybody else have any questions before we close out today? And you can take yourself off mute if you want to. ask.
Go, and I just want to say, thank you for the work that you do with the Suicide Prevention Alliance and Heidi and the board of directors. This is a new organization for me, but at no other point in time, I think, has mental health advocacy and suicide prevention advocacy been so important, because we live in a stressful society when there is no pandemic. And right now with the isolation and all these events that are going on about COVID, I think it's more important now that we get the word out than it ever has been.
It's always been important, but now, we need voices like yours, Dave, and Samantha, and and Amanda, and everybody who's on this call or Zoom, conference, and use your voices. Don't be shy. If you want to know anything, please let us know what we can do for you. We know that there are people struggling out there. So for those who are, I'm just going to say a reminder that you can please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255, or reach out to the crisis text line and text 741-741. There is help and there is hope. And each of our three guests here shows that today, that they actually survived. And each of them indicated that there is hope and that their lives are worth living. They've done a lot of great things to help others. And I can't say how much I appreciate you all for being here today. So with that, I'm going to close out today. And thank you all again for our three amazing guests, all of you who showed up today. So take care of all of you, and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.